Good to be here with you guys. I did go to Country Lane, right down the road, and Rogers, and then I spent my first 2 years of high school right here at Prospect, and transferred out because Prospect was not a good school at the time. So I was getting into a lot of trouble. On this campus, actually, me and my friends, after we would like cut class, come here, and then get kicked off of this campus because we were troublemakers. Anyways, it is a privilege and an honor for me to be here just to share briefly with you. My hope this morning is really simple. My hope is to inspire and challenge all of us collectively together to live fully into the story that God may be inviting each of us into. And that story looks very different for each of us, but the commonality I think that we all share is that most often, it is frightening to say yes to the big, grand story that God often invites us into. That's my story. That's the story that my wife and I are living into right now, and I'll talk a little bit more about that toward the end. But a couple of weeks ago, when we started this series, Stuck in a Tree, Ryan started off by telling us the story about his daughter, Ella, sweet little kid, Ella, and she's in their backyard at their house, and she climbed up this tree. And you know how it is when you're a kid and you're climbing trees. It's easy to get up the tree. What's difficult is to get down from the tree, right? And so Ella made her way up the tree, but found herself clinging for dear life on a branch because she couldn't figure out how to get down. And so she's screaming at the top of her lungs, and Ryan gets out there. And I've seen this tree. I've been in their backyard. It's not very tall, but Ella's little, right? She's 7. And so for her, this is like life and death. And so Ryan gets out there, and he's like, he could reach up and touch her feet. He's like, Ella, just drop down. It's okay. I'm right here. And she wouldn't do it, right? She's so scared. And so Ryan has to climb up and get his daughter and climb down with her. And you and I, as grown-ups, might look at that tree in that situation, that scenario, and think to ourselves, well, she's afraid because she's 7. Right? If I climbed that tree, first of all, you would question why a 32-year-old is climbing an apricot tree in his friend's backyard. But secondarily, if I climbed that tree, I could just jump down anytime I wanted to. But the reality is, it's about perspective, right? Because this happens to me too, right? A number of years ago, as an adult, as a grown man, I was on a whitewater rafting trip with some college buddies of mine. We were up at the Klamath River. I don't know if you guys know the Klamath, beautiful river on the border of California and Oregon. We're whitewater rafting, and we get to some still water, and our guide says to us, hey, listen, we're going to just swim around, enjoy the sun, enjoy the water, and we're going to do some cliff jumping. Right? And I'm there with a bunch of college dudes. And so inside, I'm like, I don't want to cliff jump. That sounds really scary. But I'm like surrounded by these, college guys. You know what happens when you're just with a bunch of dudes, like this collective machismo just grows, right? You're all afraid. Inside, you're afraid, but no one wants to be that guy that's like, I'm just going to swim, right? No one wants to be that guy. So everyone's like looking around like, what's everyone going to say? And then it just collectively builds into this massive, like, Braveheart, let's do it, right? And so our guide says, listen, we've got choices. There's a 20-foot cliff right here, and then a 60-foot cliff we can jump off of. Again, collective machismo. Everyone's like, 60 feet, yeah. And so we climb up this thing, and I remember getting to the ledge and looking down. And listen, 60 feet looks high from the bottom, but from the top, it just looks like death. Right? I don't know if you've ever done this. It was super intense. And so I'm standing there, and I'm like, okay, listen, like I'm not gonna like hide my fear anymore. I can't do this. I'm not doing this. So I look at my guide. I'm like, listen, is there any other way down? I can't do this. Right? Can I climb down, walk down? And the guide's like, no, you can't walk back down the way we came. It's like too slippery, you'll die. So he's like, this is the only way down. You have to jump. So I look at my guide and I look at my friends and I'm like, well, I'm just going to live here then. Right? So you're going to have to like tell my family I love them, throw me up a tent and some food, whatever, because I can't do this. I'm living here. But I remember at a certain point, after what seemed like hours and days of just ridicule behind me, like, just do it. I finally jumped, and I remember the moment my feet left the ground, I felt the fear dissipate immediately, and I just felt the sheer exhilaration and joy of free falling. Right? Now, again, it's perspective. Because for my guide, who does this every day for a living, for him to go up this 60-foot cliff and jump off into a river, it's nothing. Right? For him, he didn't hesitate. He just got up there. He's like, all right, and just jumped. Right? Nothing. It's perspective. Right? We look at Ella in a tree and we say, Ella, it's not that high. You're not going to hurt yourself. It's fine. My guide looks at me on this 60-foot cliff and thinks, don't be a pansy. Just jump. You'll be fine. It's okay. But at the end of the day, what this really says about the human soul is that we are so bound to our own perspective. And what we find is that when we encounter these moments in life, when we feel like we are standing on the ledge, we limit God to our perspective. Fear chokes the life right out of us because when we are standing on the ledge looking out on the possible, on the grand story that God is writing for our lives, we often think to ourselves, God, I think you can do it, but not me. I can't do this. And we step back and we continue to live life on the safety of our self-constructed ledges and branches. And so this series has all been about this one idea, and it is in your notes. In life, we are constantly presented with two choices, either to be paralyzed by fear or to be propelled by faith. To be paralyzed by fear or to be propelled by faith. And my hope this morning is to engage the reality that fear is a real thing, and that faith is incredibly difficult. That the whole, like that phrase, right? Live by faith and not by sight. That makes for a really good bumper sticker for your car next to the fish. But to live that out in real life is incredibly hard. Easy to slap on the bumper of your car, incredibly difficult to live out. And so today, what we want to do is engage some of the challenges to living by faith. We've been in Hebrews 11, and so I want to ask you to open there if you have your Bibles, or the passages are also in your notes. They'll be up here on the screen. But there are a number of challenges to faith that we want to talk about and discuss and just confront this morning. And as we do that, as we jump into Hebrews 11, the writer of Hebrews is going to point us to a man who confronted these challenges of faith and did not limit God's reality to his own perspective. It's a man you've heard of, a man named Abraham. And so the first point is this. It's in your notes. When the future seems uncertain and unknown, remember God's calling and resolve to obey. When the future seems uncertain and unknown, remember God's calling and resolve to obey. This is Hebrews 11, verses 8 to 10. It says this about Abraham's life. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land. Like a stranger in a foreign country, he lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. The writer of Hebrews tells us this really well-known story of Abraham's life from Genesis. God tells this man, Abraham, get up, pack your things, take your family, and go to the land I will show you. And so Abraham packs his things and begins to move without knowing where he is going. Abraham's future is uncertain and it is unknown. And yet because God has called him, he resolves to obey. And he does, he obeys. He gets up and he goes. There's something really interesting that the writer of Hebrews points us to in the passage. He tells us that Abraham lived in tents. Him and his family, they lived in tents. And they lived in tents because Abraham, it tells us, was looking forward to the city with foundations. They lived in tents because he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose builder and architect is God. Here's the reality for your life and mine more often than not. We try so hard to build foundations in the present. We try so hard to build foundations to grow roots in the temporary present. And the reason we do this is because the present is safe. The present is certain. The present is known. Right? The present is now. You are living the present. You know what the present looks like. You know what it feels like. You know the challenges that it poses. You know the rewards and the benefits that it offers. You know the present. It is known and it is certain. And because of that, we try so hard to build our foundations in the present. And yet God, I believe, is calling each of us to live nomadically in our hearts. To say, God, I will not build roots where you are not building roots. I will not lay foundations where you are not laying foundations. I will live spiritually in a tent, ready to pack up and move when you call me to move. Are you living your life this way? Are you ready to go when God tells you to go? For so long in my life, I didn't live this way. I would chisel away. Every time I found a semi-safe place, I would chisel away and try to build a foundation there. And God had to do so much deconstructing of my life to say, no, Jay, this is not the plan I have for you. Get up and go. Here's the reality. We often think that time is what moves us forward. Right? That when I was 7, I was immature. When I was 15, I was still immature, but a little more mature. When I was 22, I was starting to understand maturity. By the time I hit 30, I was mature. That's what we think. Right? That's how life works. You just get older and you grow and progress. That time progresses us. But you laugh because you know this is not true. Time progresses nothing but time. When it comes to following Jesus, here's the difficult but beautiful reality. Obedience is what progresses us. It is obedience that moves us forward. You know, you can live your entire life never budging spiritually. Sitting in that same dormant, static place you've always been. And it doesn't matter how many church services you go to or how many Bible studies you've been to or how many books on spirituality you've read. If you do not obey, if you do not remember God's calling for your life and resolve to obey him, then you will sit dormant, static in that same safe, mundane place of life. When God is inviting you, and he is inviting me to a life that is full and rich. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Weight of Glory, says this: we are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at sea. We are far too easily pleased. I want you to know that the shallow comfort that the present offers you pales in comparison to the vibrant, rich, deep, life-giving story that God's future has in store for you. And so when your future seems uncertain and unknown, remember that he has called you to something better and bigger and deeper, and resolve to obey. Because it is obedience that will move us forward. Now you might say, well, listen, that's great about the future, but what about my present? Because here's the deal. It's not just my future that's uncertain and unknown. My present is really tough. Right now, in the present, I have situations and circumstances that seem absolutely impossible to overcome. And this is in your notes. Here's what the writer of Hebrews encourages us with. When it seems impossible, remember that God is faithful and capable. When it seems impossible, remember that God is faithful and capable. Verses 11 and 12 of Hebrews 11 continues Abraham's story, and it tells us this: By faith, Abraham, even though he was past age, and Sarah herself was barren, was enabled to become a father because he considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, and he as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. You know this story. Abraham and Sarah are promised early on by God that they would have tons of kids. So many kids, in fact, that their kids would become a nation, a chosen nation, God's chosen people. And Abraham is approaching 100 years of age. The Bible tells us well past childbearing age, right? Him and Sarah, his wife. And they have no kids. I mean, is there any more impossible situation than being 100 and thinking to yourself, when will I have kids? Right? It's this impossible situation. And this is the situation, the circumstance in which Abraham and Sarah find themselves. But what you find in the writing of Hebrews is that it tells us Abraham was enabled. He was enabled to have children in his old age, him and Sarah. He was enabled because he considered God to be faithful. The reality is we throw this truth backwards in our lives. We say, God, I will consider you faithful when you enable these things to happen. We are professional cynics. We live in a world of cynicism. We have access to so much information and so quickly. I mean, we have access to information in ways that no humans in the history of humanity have had before. When I'm at home chatting with my wife, if I say anything that sounds off, right? If I say anything like the slightest bit off, like, oh yeah, I don't know if Tom Cruise is a Scientologist really. Right? Like, or something really stupid like that. If I say something like that, my wife immediately, if she doubts what I'm saying, is her immediate response always is, I'm just going to Google check you. Right? And with it, I mean, it takes her 2 seconds to type something, and immediately she can debunk anything wrong that I've said. Like, no, you're totally wrong. There's like 18 different links to websites that tell, right? I mean, there's so much information and it's so accessible. And so this is our approach to all sorts of things, including the scriptures. And sadly, this is our approach oftentimes to God himself. We are cynics. Say, God, I'm not sure. I know you did that back then, but I don't know. You don't really do that kind of stuff now, right? Like miracles and this impossible situation in my life, I don't know. I don't know that you're going to really actually show up and change things. We say, God, when you enable me to get through this impossible situation, then I will believe that you are faithful. And yet the scriptures tell us that Abraham believed God to be faithful. And it was his belief in God that then allowed Abraham to have children. This impossible situation to overcome. I love this quote from Oswald Chambers, who says, faith is deliberate confidence in the character of God, whose ways you may not understand at the time. Faith is deliberate confidence in the character of God, whose ways you may not understand at the time. So that brings us to this last point, this idea of not understanding God. And here's how the writer of Hebrews encourages us, and this is the third point in your notes. When God seems illogical and unreasonable, remember that God is not limited by logic and reason. When God seems illogical and unreasonable, remember that God is not limited by logic and reason. You and I, we've all been there. We've all been there where God does something or chooses not to do something, and we look at him and we say, are you serious? God, really? Like that's your response? Or that's your lack of response? Really, this is the way you're going to let this play out? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Totally illogical, totally unreasonable. The writer of Hebrews reminds us of this story from Abraham's life, verses 17 to 19. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Most of you know this story. Abraham and Sarah are finally given the gift of the promise, a son, Isaac, in their old age. And years after having Isaac, God shows up again, and he says to Abraham, listen, here's what I want you to do. I know I promised you many descendants. I know this son, Isaac, is kind of the culmination of that promise. Here's what I'd like you to do. I'd like you to slay your son. I want you to sacrifice, to murder your son, to kill your son on an altar. Give him back to me. I mean, is there anything more illogical and unreasonable than that? If you didn't know the end of the story, you would begin questioning the character of our God. You would say, let's be honest, this is a sick and vile thing to ask. How could you do this? And yet Abraham says yes. Abraham packs the necessities for an altar. He takes his son and his blade, and they go up a mountain. Abraham builds an altar, and he lays his beloved son on this altar. You know how the story goes. He takes his knife, his blade, and he lifts it to slay his own son, to follow through on God's calling. As illogical and unreasonable as the request was, Abraham said, God asked me to do it, and I'm doing it. And God shows up, provides a ram in the thickets. I mean, there is nothing more illogical and unreasonable than Abraham's situation here. To have to murder your own son, I mean, that's like beyond comprehension for us. It doesn't make any sense. And yet Abraham, the writer of Hebrews tells us, and this is key, do not miss this. The writer of Hebrews tells us that Abraham doesn't just blindly, thoughtlessly obey. It tells us that Abraham reasoned. He reasoned that God could raise the dead. Now, this is going to come as a shock to many of you, but it is not normal for dead people to come back to life. That's not normative. That's not just a thing you do on Tuesdays, right? You know, like, I just die and come back. It's like, cool. It's good for my heart, right? No one does that. So what the writer of Hebrews essentially is telling us is that Abraham reasons, because coming back to life, dying and coming back to life, that's unreasonable. That's illogical. That's unbelievable. It's unthinkable. And so what the writer of Hebrews tells us is that Abraham reasons that God could do the unreasonable. Abraham reasons that God could do the unthinkable, the unbelievable, the illogical. Abraham reasons that God is not limited by, and that God does not exist within his own reason. Does this make sense? Abraham reasons that God is beyond his reasoning. When God seems unreasonable, when God seems illogical, remember that God is not limited to logic and reason. You see, our narrow scope of understanding life and seeing the world, God does not live in that box. In fact, if God lived in that box, he would cease to be God. Why would we put our trust in a deity who is limited just like us? He is only God in the sense that he is not limited, he is not confined, and he is not enslaved to the shackles of our realities. God exists bigger and beyond. And if you believe that, then that has to show up in the way you live your life. It's not enough to think theologically, to know in your mind that God exists beyond human limits. You must express that reality in the way you follow him. when he invites you into the impossible to say, this is truly impossible for me, but God is not limited. He is not confined to human reason and logic, and so I will jump and say yes. Tim Keller has this beautiful quote from his book, The Reason for God. And Keller says this: "We modern people think of miracles as the suspension of the natural order, but Jesus meant them to be the restoration of the natural order. The Bible tells us that God did not originally make the world to have disease, hunger, and death in it. Jesus has come to redeem where it is wrong and heal the world where it is broken. His miracles are not just proofs that he has power, but also wonderful foretastes of what he is going to do with that power. Jesus' miracles are not just a challenge to our minds, and I love this, but a promise to our hearts that the world we all want is coming." Amen. God is in the restoration business. God is in the business of redemption and renewal. God is passionate about remaking and reorganizing and rearranging and bringing back to life, resurrecting the broken things of our existence. And if we want to live into that eternal kingdom reality, we can, and we can do it today. I mean, that's the beauty of God's kingdom. Eternity is not some point in time after the grave. Eternity exists beyond time. The eternity of God's kingdom rushes backwards into your history. It is fully alive in your present, and it is leading you forward into your future. And if you believe that to be true, then you are free to jump into anything that God is calling you to jump into, as illogical and unreasonable as it may seem. The reality is death, sin, brokenness, all of that, blindness, hurt, pain, shame, grief, all of that, that is not within the original design and intent of God's story for humanity. Those things are results of brokenness, of sin, of the fall. And if we choose to allow our realities to be shackled by the brokenness of our present, what we are saying is that God is not big enough or strong enough or capable enough to redeem our stories. But I believe, and I think you believe, that he is. And if you do, you've got to jump in. I want to tell you the story of a man. There's a picture right up here. This is a man named Philippe Petit. It's an old picture from the 60s. Philippe Petit was a juggler and a tightrope artist. He would, walk on wires from high places, like in the circus and stuff. I don't know anything about that, but anyways, that's what he did. And one day, Philippe Petit was at a dentist's office in Paris, and he was in the waiting room waiting to get his teeth checked up on, and he saw a magazine, and he picked up the magazine, and in the magazine was an article about the not yet built, at the time, World Trade Center towers, the two towers of the World Trade Center. And Philippe Petit became obsessed with the towers of the World Trade Center. And he didn't just become obsessed with the towers just because he thought they would be beautiful. He became obsessed specifically because he wanted to draw a line across, a steel cable across the two towers, and tightrope walk across the two towers. He became obsessed with this dream of his. And so from 1968 to 1974, 6 years of his life, Philippe Petit gave everything he had, money, time, resources. He gathered all his friends for support. He gave everything, every waking moment of his life was centered on getting ready to tightrope walk across the two towers of the World Trade Center. I mean, he did all sorts of stuff, right? He broke into the World Trade Center multiple times. He would hide out and then sleep there overnight so that he could walk around freely and just get a lay of the land. He made fake IDs for himself and for his friends. He made fake clothes that resembled the workers at the World Trade Center so that him and his friends, his compatriots, could go in and out and sneak in and out to do all the work that they needed to do to get ready for this thing. He built a scale model of the towers in his backyard so that he can compensate, like he could figure out the swaying and the wind and what he would need to do to make sure he was safe. Right? He assembled a 200-foot long steel cable to use as the wire. In fact, he paid multiple times inordinate amounts of money to fly up in a helicopter. He paid those professional helicopter rides to see the city. He'd pay tons of money to go up with his friend Jim Moore, who was a photographer. He did that a number of times to get aerial shots of the World Trade Center towers. I mean, he spent money, time, resources. He prepared himself for 6 years to do this thing. But nobody remembers him for any of that. No one remembers Philippe Petit for being a diligent studier of, a researcher of the World Trade Center. Nobody remembers him for all the hard work and time and energy and effort he put into preparation. People remember Philippe Petit because at 7:45 a.m. on Wednesday, August 7th, 1974, he did this. For 45 minutes, Philippe Petit walked back and forth between the two towers. It's about 200 feet distance between the North Tower and the South Tower. And Philippe Petit walked back and forth. In 45 minutes, he did that 200-foot trek on this wire 8 times. He was dancing. At a certain point, he laid down on the wire. He jumped up and down on the wire. And there were police officers and port authorities on both towers trying to get him down, but what are you going to do, right? What police officer's like, I'm going out to get him? No one's doing that, right? So like, you better get over here. Get over here right now. Right? It's like no one. I got to tell you, Philippe Petit broke numerous laws doing this, so I'm not trying to say look at this wonderful example of no. I mean, he broke a ton of laws and got arrested. But the arresting officer, Sergeant Charles Daniels of the New York Port Authority, at his press conference describing Philippe Petit's arrest and what he had seen that day, instead of talking about all the laws that Petit had broken or the ways in which he'd endangered himself or any of that stuff, Sergeant Charles Daniels of the New York Port Authority instead said this at his press conference. I observed the tightrope dancer, because you can't call him a walker. Upon seeing us, he started to smile and laugh, and he started going into a dancing routine on the high wire. He was bouncing up and down. His feet were actually leaving the wire, and then he would resettle back on the wire again. Unbelievable, really. Everybody was spellbound. You could live your life spending years and years preparing yourself, reading every book about faith that there is, listening to every message, sermon, podcast that you can possibly find on faith, on living a life of faith. You can spend decades of your life preparing yourself, filling your head with knowledge on what it looks like, how you might become a person of faith. But at the end of the day, if you want to live a story that changes the world, if you want to live a story that has eternal kingdom ramifications and impact, then you must step out. You have to trust. Because all the knowledge in the world, all the preparation, all of that is for naught. It's for nothing if you stand safely on the ledge. This is the story that my wife and I are living. For the last 8 years, we were at a church here in San Jose that we loved, still love dearly. Some of our closest friends are still there. And late last year, we sensed God calling us into something else. And long story short, that something else was the church plant that Westgate is sending out in September, Awakening Church. And so my good friend Ryan came to me and said, hey man, we can't pay you and I have no idea what it's going to look like, but you should come do this with us. I don't know if anyone's coming. We don't know where we're going yet. Want to come, right? And we just sensed God saying, go. I mean, like, my wife and I couldn't sleep. This is how we knew. For about a week and a half at night, we both started waking up at 3 a.m. Like, just out of nowhere, like, wake up. And my wife is way smarter than me. So about halfway into the week, she was like, maybe instead of complaining about not sleeping, we should pray. You know, like I'm the pastor in the house. And she's like, maybe we should pray, huh? I'm like, yeah, you're so smart. And we started praying, and we just could not shake this sense that God was calling us into this new thing. And I'll be honest with you, we're not at the end of it, right? We're just at the beginning of Awakening Church, and things are uncertain and unknown. And some stuff feels so impossible. And sometimes I'm like, this whole situation is so illogical. At the end of the day, I know that God has called us to plant something in the heart of our city, to awaken a generation to new life in Jesus. And so I'm stepping out. And it's not because I'm a great man of faith, it's because it took me 32 years to finally step out. And I'll tell you this, it is frightening, but it is startlingly beautiful. And I feel so full of life. I mean, I wake up in the morning and feel so ready to go. It's because I'm living a life, finally, and I know God has called me into. So that's my hope for you, my prayer for you, whatever that might be for you. Maybe it's a relationship you need to mend. Maybe it's a new direction in your career, professionally. Maybe it's in the way you love your spouse or your kids and rearranging your time to do that more intentionally. Maybe it is to leave the comfort of this place and go with us to plant a church. We have no idea what it's going to look like. I don't know what it is for you, but whatever God is calling you to, my prayer for you is that you would resolve to obey. That you would resolve to obey, that you would remember that God is not limited by logic and reason. I know it's scary. I know it's daunting. And so I would encourage you with this prayer from Teresa of Avila as we close. Let nothing disturb you. Let nothing frighten you. All things pass away. God never changes. Patience obtains all things. He who has God finds he lacks nothing. God alone suffices. Let me pray for you. God, we admit tonight that we are frail and broken and flawed, and we are so often driven by fear. But God, today, this morning, in this place, would you swell up in our hearts a confidence and a trust in you? That faith would stop being a concept or an idea, and that faith would be the reality into which we live. God, make us aware of how mundane the safety of our self-constructed lives are, and to begin deepening the hunger and desire in us to jump into a greater, grander, more beautiful, more epic story, and that is the story that you are calling us into. Give us the strength in our legs to move forward, to say yes, to obey, and to follow. We love you, God. In Jesus' name, amen.